Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, debt slaves, serfs, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks, news fakers. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome, and let's get to more of this current series of videos I'm doing about the whole idea of Russian propaganda and fake news, because these are the top stories of the day. And one of the other stories I'm going to cover here is this House bill, HR 6393, that passed on November 13th. And Intelligence Authorization Act for fiscal year 2017, and it's aimed at addressing Russian media specifically, and this so-called threat of Russian media and Russian propaganda and this whole idea of fake news. So the government and corporations, as I pointed out in the other video, corporations like Facebook and Microsoft and the like, are all getting together to address this idea of Russian infiltration of the media, as well as so-called fake news. And the government's also acting very quickly, as they have with this new Intelligence Authorization Act for fiscal year 2017, that includes this clause about addressing media manipulation, what they call, which is ironic. And of course, all the pundits and a lot of editorials are pointing out the irony of the fact that the United States has such a history of meddling in other people's elections and producing its own fake news for its own agendas. Now this same government is producing legislation to address the fact that other people are doing it, but of course that's misleading, because the fact is the government and corporations are more involved in fake news and Russian propaganda, or in propaganda, than what we see the government going after. But there are forms of media manipulation, of course, the establishment, and this is where it gets funny, because when you go down the list, they're all things that the CIA and the United States government have been involved in countries all over the world for 100 years. Establishment or funding of front groups, covert broadcasting, media manipulation, disinformation, and forgeries, funding of agents of influence, incitement and offensive counterintelligence, assassinations, and terrorist acts. All part of this media manipulation, Russian media. But a lot of speculation, of course, this is to control the alternative media. It's more about a commercial threat than an actual Russian threat or fake news threat. Russia today has no sponsors. They don't have to kowtow to sponsors. They can do stories in the United States on their network that can't be addressed in the United States because of all these corporate sponsors. And the government has no right really to criticize fake news either, like I say, because it's very well documented that they've created a vast amount themselves and knowingly. So it's not even like a conspiracy theory. But the history of this post-war 1948, winding down the war, wartime propaganda, is when the idea of using propaganda in the American public was forbidden. But in 2013, there was a sort of deregulation that is allowing for certain forms of domestic propaganda just by changing the definition, which of course I've called out before. This whole idea that they don't like the rules, they just change the definitions. But anyway, this is part of a conservative effort to protect perhaps corporate media to a certain extent. Corporate media, of course, the ones that maintain the government narrative and the corporate narrative, which is so important to them. But the latest poll, we've seen a deterioration over the years and decades of the reputation of the veracity of material coming from the government, and certainly the mainstream media. We have to be at an all-time low now. 6% don't trust the mainstream media, and therefore they're turning to the net and the alternative. And so the government and corporations have no choice but to go after so-called fake news and go after this alternative market. So the alternative media is actually a huge threat. And it's also part of internet censorship that everyone has been interested in as far as the government. They've seen what can be done out there. They go on and on about trolls and the incivility of people on the internet and all the crazy shit that people post. But that's not really what they're concerned about. They're mostly concerned about people finding out there's an alternative narrative to the government, and that's what they really fear. And one of the things we have to remember is that ultimately the internet, the model they want is the cable TV model. They want different highways for different people pay, and and they want to control the narrative, and that will be the future of the internet. And so we have to bear that in mind when we see what corporations are doing regarding the net and what the government does regarding the net. And this whole discussion of fake news is pretty interesting. I was watching a football game the other night, and even the mediators on the game, the announcers were talking about the concept of fake news. So it's really entered the national discussion on every level. And so the government and corporate work is getting done, because if everyone is talking about it and they're accepting the fact that there's this fake news that's a problem, then they're getting their propaganda done right. But the corporate media also promotes a lot of the big volatile sites and feeds them this fake news. That's one of the theories, and I can buy that, because when I look at things like InfoWars and whatnot, I wonder why they are not censored to the same degree that a lot of smaller pundits on YouTube seem to be censored. So that also makes sense in the context. So there's certain kinds of fake news that they like in order to utilize it for another political tool. But overall, in the meantime, we have, once again, the government moving. Now they're calling for hearings to investigate Russian propaganda, and they'll get into fake news and everything else. So, boy, all the things that happen that they don't want to hold hearings for or investigate, they don't think are important enough. But something like this whole trumped up, so to speak, fake witch hunt that's going on about Russian infiltration of the election is quite a piece of work. I'm useful idiot, don't you be one too?